All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Arc Menu Talk Series number 11. And we're very fortunate to be hosting here both online and in the room live. So we'll have Barbara managing those dynamics, and we've got microphones on in the room. And our discussion questions and feedback and opening questions that you may have, we'll have at the end of the seminar. If you have any clarification questions or want to jot things in the chat on the way through, that would be fantastic. I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedjigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place, and to elders past and present. And what we do know about our traditional custodians is that they are wonderful storytellers, and we're very fortunate to have Carol Kulik here today, who is a fantastic storyteller. More on that later. And we do have a broad audience, bringing together our Australian Research Council Grant Centre participants, as well as additional people from other faculties today, including the School of Management and Governance, so welcome. And I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that our industry transformation is a co-design centre. So we have academics and industry partners who have co-designed our research questions and solutions. And this training centre is a two-way flow between PhD student training with academics and placements in industry, and then back into industry as well via short courses. And that's particularly pertinent given that we have Carol Kulik in the room today. Carol's talk comes from the Management Lab. We have 3 labs in our centre, and Carol Kulik is the Bradley Distinguished Professor at the University of South Australia, and importantly, she set up the Centre for Workplace Excellence. She has vast expertise on effective management of the workforce, and how to design motivating work, interactions between humans and machines, and a particular expertise in enabling workforce diversity, especially with age and gender. She has over 90 articles in our top management journals, and importantly, some of her work that she's going to talk about today comes from a book she co-authored on human resources for the non-HR human resource manager. So the consistent theme in Carol's work is bridging rigorous academic research with industry, and she's done that in her professional roles. So for example, Carol was president of our peak academic professional body, the Academy of Management Association, and in her presidential address, she talked about researcher and end user relationships. And so she thinks about this big picture of collaboration whilst transforming industry and organisations one at a time. She set up funded research industry centre, such as her centre, and also created tangible outputs from her collaborations. She's got some fantastic explainer videos, for example, on mature age worker engagement, and this very topic of researcher and end user engagement. So we can send some of those videos through to you later, and it's a fantastic example of working and co-designing, delivering co-designed outcomes from research. So with no more ado, Carol Kulik, I'll quickly flip the computer around so that you can see her in person, and then we will get on with business.
Hello everyone, welcome. So, I'd like to tell you about my brother-in-law. His name is John, and when John graduated from university, he immediately got a job at a steel company in Chicago, and his role was selling steel products to corporate customers. Turns out John was fabulous at this job. Because he's the kind of person who, you sit him down next to a stranger, within the first few minutes he will find a point of commonality and it'll deepen into a relationship. such a good salesperson. In fact, John was so good at his job that he soon got promoted into sales manager role. And that's when he started calling me. So it's sort of helpful to have a sister-in-law who is a management professor, because he would call and he'd say, Carol, I just don't get it. I hired the best people I saw on paper, and now that they're here, they're not working out. And then a month or so later, it would be, Carol, what am I supposed to do about this? My sales team has been working so well. We've been selling the steel products that the company told us to, and now they've completely changed the reward system. So I have to go out and tell my team that we're not going to make the targets. They're not getting a bonus this month. And then there was the call a few years later that was, Carol, the company's in financial trouble and we're downsizing, and I'm gonna have to walk into my team and tell them that half of them are being sacked, even though it's not their fault. And I tell you this story because I think John is not at all unusual. He's the kind of person who got into the business with no aspirations or goals of being a manager. He thought he'd enjoy sales, and he did. He thought he'd be good at sales, and he was. And I think managers are one of the few roles that you get into because you're really good at something other than being a manager, right? People don't aspire to it. When we asked little kids, when we asked 6-year-olds or 9-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? Have you ever heard any of them say, ooh, I want to be a manager? And do any of them ever dress up as managers for a Halloween? Right? We don't have any of this kind of aspirations. But I think that's actually a real problem from an organizational perspective. Because if you don't aspire to be a manager and you don't have that identity developing, you're probably not looking for opportunities to develop managerial skills. And then suddenly you're in the role and you have to do everything by trial and error. So you're pretty uninformed. And the thing that I really want to emphasize in our discussion today is how mission critical managers are. And I hope I'll convince you at that point. So let me tell you a little bit about what we know about line managers and their relationships with employees. Employees tell us that they experience 2 significant human resource events every work week. So these are things that employees really care about. It might be conversations about their careers or their skill development or their work arrangements. But importantly, they are not having those conversations with HR managers. They're having them with their line managers. And the other thing that I think is interesting is employees tell us that they have access to human resource management practices that human resource directors tell us their company doesn't offer. You know, as a research academic, one of the problems that I used to have in my research is that HR directors would say, oh, we have this wonderful mentoring program. And then you would talk to employees and they're like, what mentoring? Nobody's mentoring me. And it was because the line managers weren't implementing those practices. Now we're seeing the alternative discrepancy. Line managers are actually doing things in their units spontaneously that people higher in the organization don't know. Now I want to emphasize that this is actually a really good thing. You know, for the longest time in the academic literature, we've encouraged organizations to think about devolution. And what we mean by that is take some of the day-to-day people management activities that HR managers used to do, put them in the hands of line managers so that your HR people are doing more of the long-term things, more of the strategic things. And this way, line managers are making those decisions on the ground where they have a better understanding of their employees' needs, they're in the right place at the right time, they can design more personalized, you know, kinds of arrangements and practices. And so for the most part, this is a really good thing, and we're seeing that. When we look at organizations that have done this devolution process, employees tell us they feel that they're being managed better. The organization in general is more effective. I think the real question though is it good for line managers? Because they're taking on these big responsibilities, and I feel kind of bad for them. I think they're kind of underappreciated in their roles. And that's why I use this term unsung heroes. I think we really need to put them in the spotlight a little bit more and demonstrate a little bit more support. So comparing this generation of managers to previous generations of managers, there's no question that their job has gotten a lot harder. So we know, for example, that line managers today are responsible for more employees than previous generations were. If you go back in the management literature and you look in the 1980s, we, the academic researchers, were recommending that line managers be responsible for 5 or 6 employees. Wow, that's a shockingly low number now. In most organizations, that number is at least double, and it's not at all unusual for managers to have 20 or more employees who are reporting directly to them. So their workload's just gotten bigger. The second thing that's happened is managers' budgets have gotten smaller. So even if it looks like a lot of money in terms of absolute dollars, you have to remember it's getting spread across many more employees. So managers have fewer dollars to spend per employee for reward systems or for training purposes. So, that's pretty hard. They're spread thin. And the third thing is that we're asking managers today to manage employees who work in remote and dispersed kinds of work environments. And we have to remember these are working arrangements that managers themselves only started experiencing a couple of years ago, right? So they never saw managers do a good job in this kind of environment. They didn't have a lot of opportunity to learn best practice. So a lot of times when I talk to roomfuls of managers, I always tell them, if it feels hard, it's because it is hard. Like, you should feel like it's hard. It's a really tough gig that you've got. And here's what's happening. This is some research that was reported in the Wall Street Journal. And what the researchers did was look at the US labor market. They studied over 1 million people who were working in the labor force between 2019 and 2022. And what they found was that among people who were promoted into managerial roles for the very first time, 29% quit within 1 month. The first time I saw this statistic, I was staggered by it. I thought, isn't that a shame? These are the people who you think are your best and brightest, and you're giving them a promotion that you think is a reward, and instead what you're doing is creating a flight risk. And maybe even more worrisome are surveys like this, which focus on people who are just entering the labor market. And in this survey, 62% of new graduates, so people who are just getting their first job on the career path, 62% say they never want to be a manager, that their plan is to be individual contributors their entire career. So my point is, we haven't made this managerial job very attractive to people. Now, this is what I'd like to do during our time together. I know that the common denominator across you, the common interest, is in digital transformation as a strategy for reducing carbon emissions, resource consumption, and waste. Pull that directly from your website, so I know that it's the unifying factor. But just for a moment, I'd really like you to just put the little digital piece aside. Let's just think about transformation. From an organizational perspective, this is what we know about how to transform organizations. So the organization needs to take on a new mission, the organization needs to change its culture. What we used to recommend as management researchers, no, we still recommend this as management researchers, is what we say is blitz employees through every channel you've got. So this new message that you're trying to communicate, talk about it during the hiring process, talk about it during onboarding, talk about it in performance reviews, talk about it in development. The more employees are going to hear this message, the more it's likely to stick. The other thing that we used to recommend is use social channels, use relationships to reinforce the message as well. So for example, there's this whole body of literature in socialization and onboarding where we learned that it was much better to onboard new employees as a cohort. If everybody got onboarded at the same time, everybody heard the same message at the same time, and so when everybody started work, they could socialize one another and keep reminding themselves about the message. Then COVID happened, and a lot of the things that we used to do face-to-face, we moved online and started using technology. So we remote hired, we remote onboarded, we remote trained. So we did a lot of things that kind of removed some of those social relationships. And what we know right now in the post-COVID era, we know that organizations are just a lot less sticky. People tell us that they don't make friends at work anymore. They used to have a best friend at work and they don't. They're less likely to know people outside of their own teams, and they're finding it easier to quit because it was the relationships that held them together. So without those relational channels, a lot of the messaging gets lost. What I want to emphasize here in this transformation process is the one enduring relationship you still have is between employees and their manager. So we're asking a lot now of this relationship. Now we'll we will now layer on the digital piece to the transformation process. Not only are you trying to change the message, but you're trying to change the message with technology, and the technology itself is changing. So it's not a single message, it's a continuously changing message. You're looking for a workforce who is motivated to continuously learn and upskill, who are keen to experiment and innovate. So the digitality, I think, makes the transformation even harder and puts more pressure on that link between manager and employee. So I want to talk about three things. I just want to give you three examples. Developing employees, rewarding employees, and caring for employee well-being as places where managers are really central. And I just want to invite you to think about line managers and how you could help them help you in this transformation process. And for each of those topics, I'm going to give you two things. I'm going to give you a really big what if question. So like, what if we really took this seriously? What would organizations look like? And I'm going to do something that might feel a little uncomfortable and painful. When I ask you that what if question, I'm going to take a few moments, less than a minute, to just be quiet and let you sit with the question. I just want you to hold on to it for a minute. And then I'm going to do a transition and say, okay, so that was the big what if. But now consider, what if you're a line manager and your organization hasn't done those big what if steps? What can we ask line managers to do on the ground? So go from the really big picture to the tiny small one. Sound okay? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about developing employees. We know that there is an overall trend toward micro-learning, getting little bits of training, and self-initiated training. This is one of the big places where we've lost a lot of social relationships. We now deliver training in a much more individualized way. It's presented much more on demand. So you're not sitting in one room with everyone. And for the most part, again, this is a really good thing. It has lots of advantages. But I want to point out a few of the problems. People are very poor judges, first of all, of what they need to know. So in some of the work that I do, We know that there are certain skills that people need to know a lot before they even know what they don't know. Good examples are grammar and cultural competencies. You actually have to know a lot before you can say, oh, I need to learn more. So people sometimes don't know when to start, and you really run the risk that you can miss the people that you most need to get that training. People are also very poor judges of how they should learn. So most of us much prefer to learn all at once, what we would call mass training, and it turns out that space training is much better. As an academic researcher, I get exposed to lots of training about research methods and statistics, and I used to be so impatient with morning and afternoon teas. I would be like, what a waste this half hour is. We're all standing around chit-chatting, and we could be learning something, and it's a half hour where I have to try not to eat those pastries, we should just speed it up. And it's only after learning more about the training literature that I really appreciate what important work is happening in that half hour. That's the period where your brain is starting to knit things together. We also do a poor job of judging how much we need to learn. So we speed through the foundational stuff because we're trying to get to the interesting things. So my point is, people don't do a very good job of learning on their own. And as a result, researchers estimate that only about 60% of training transfers immediately. So 40% of your training just goes right down the drain. And if you look a year later, only 30% of training is still being transferred to the job. So that's pretty disappointing. Now this is just talking about one person getting trained once. Now kind of multiply that and say, well, what we really want is for people to be continuously learning and learning lots of different things. It gets harder and harder. I just wanted to give you this little example of Culture Amp. Culture Amp is an HR company, and one of the big things they do is deliver training. And so their business is learning. And one of the things that Culture Amp does for their own employees is if you say you want to learn something and you can show it's related to your job, the company will pay 90% of the training. If you say you want to learn something and it has no relationship to your job, hey, I'd like to learn flower arranging. That just sounds really interesting to me. The company will still pay 50%. And the idea is what you're trying to reward is just the act of learning without tying other outcomes to it. Now, what does this have to do with managers? It turns out managers are really critical in determining that transfer of training process. So there's lots of things they can do. When an employee comes back from training, they can say, show me what you learned. Hey, here's an opportunity to practice. You made a mistake? That's okay. That's part of the learning. Now, it is very easy for me to say that. It is incredibly difficult for a manager to do it on the ground because they have deadlines, they have customers, they have things they gotta do, so they don't really have time to create that space. So here's your what if. What if, when we were designing training and development, sure, we kept the learner in mind, but what if we also kept the manager in mind? What if we designed training with a particular focus on the manager's needs? How would you build in enough slack so managers could facilitate transfer of training? How would you give managers access to rewards for employees who make mistakes? How counterintuitive does that sound? How would you give managers credit for helping employees to transfer training? And remember what I said about the what if being followed by silence. Now, most managers don't work in environments that give them that slack, so they have to be quite proactive. And remember, I promised you a start here. So one of the things we always encourage line managers to do after they send employees off for training is to build a sandbox for them when they come back. So there's a manager I know who founded a small boutique marketing company. And she recently sent her designers for a training course on artificial intelligence. And she believes artificial intelligence is going to change the whole marketing industry. She's probably right. But the price tag on this training is really high. So if only 60% of it is going to transfer, it's not a very good investment. So one of the things she did was when employees came back from the training, she gave them a brief. You got to design this campaign for this client, but the client was hypothetical. And then she separated out space on the calendar so they could spend the next few days working on that. Brilliant idea and pretty simple to implement. So that was topic one. Now let's talk a little bit about reward systems. One of the big things that's really taking hold in organizations are what the academic literature calls star performer strategies. Star performer strategies are reward systems that focus on one specific metric. So this might be things like billable hours, new clients, sales, things like that. So you know this thing, transformation, one message, consistent. This is one way to get there, but you're really drilling in. It's something that was always popular in accountancy and in law, but what I find surprising is how much we're seeing it in other areas as well. Your doctor, for example, is probably rewarded not for the number of patients she cures, but the number of patients she sees. So that's a really good example of, this metric. Now, in a lot of ways, this makes sense. It's very results focused. And researchers who study star performers tell us that, if you look at a normal distribution, if you can find the people out in the tail, in most organizations, that star performer contributes 9 times the value of an average performer. In some organizations, it could be 400 times the value of the average performer. So in a lot of ways, this is a great strategy for transformation. But it actually creates a lot of pressure on managers because of what gets lost. So I'll give you 3 examples. One of the things that happens in a star performer strategy is you can start to grow brilliant jerks. The star performer strategy does not reward people for helping, for mentoring, for socializing. We see it in the law profession. We know that when senior lawyers are rewarded for billable hours, they don't share their billable work with junior people, and they don't mentor them in how to do the billable work. So it's a problem if you're a line manager because, now suddenly you're the one who's responsible for all the mentoring and development. In the extreme, employees can start to game the system. So in banking, we know that when Wells Fargo employees were rewarded for opening new accounts, 3,500 Wells Fargo employees opened 3.5 million fraudulent accounts. So an extreme example, but here's how it can blow up. And the other thing is, if everything is changing so rapidly, how do you even know what that metric is? Finding the metric requires that you focus on the past. So think about a software company. In the early days of your company, as you're developing new products, more lines of code is a really good indicator of productivity. People are moving closer to a finished product. As you get closer to that finished product, fewer lines of code might signal that your programmers are finding more elegant algorithms to do the work. So it might actually be the reverse. It might be that your most productive programmers are the ones who code the least. So these are all things that we now expect managers to handle in these kinds of systems. So the what if that I want to ask you is, what if organizations design systems to reward the right kinds of behavior rather than the results that come out of that behavior? And specifically, what if they rewarded values? Now, a lot of times I ask managers, do you reward values? And they say, oh yes, of course. Because in our performance evaluation system, we have 5 questions, and the last one is on values. But I'm asking, really, think big, right? What if you really put values at the front, at the top? What if all 5 of those were about values? And I gave you the example of Atlassian here. So Atlassian is a software project management company. And a few years ago, they made an announcement that they were no longer going to reward or measure individual performance. Those indicators were just gone from the performance system. Instead, you were going to get rewarded for your contribution to team performance and for your ability to display Atlassian values. One of the Atlassian values is be the change you seek. So innovation, proactivity. So again, what if? What if your organization put values first? What if you designed your performance review and reward systems to focus on values? Would it change who came to the organization, who wanted to work for you? Would it change who you hired? Would it change the kinds of people that you put into managerial roles? Would it change what you wanted managers to do? What would happen in the long run? Would it have an impact on your organization's sustainability? Would it have an impact on your organization's failure rate? Would it change your organization's performance? Take a minute. Now, of course, most organizations don't put value-based behavior up front. So what should you do if you're a line manager in a system that's moving toward a star performer strategy that focuses on specific metrics? What should you do instead? And I told you the star heroes were going to be really simple, something you don't need anybody's approval to do, something you can do tomorrow. You could practice saying thank you. It's very interesting that in surveys, employees tell us 80% of employees say gratitude is a big motivator for them. It motivates them to really change their behavior. But only 10% of employees say that they experience gratitude in their workplace. Bummer. We're really missing an opportunity there. But I have a tip for you. It's something that I learned in the communication literature. It turns out that most of us, when we say thank you, we don't do it in the best possible way. We tend to say thank you in a way that keeps the focus on us. So I might say, thank you, you've made my job so much less stressful. Oh, thank you, I'm so relieved now. But it turns out that our gratitude is much more affirming if we keep the focus on the person who has done the act. So thank you for taking time out of your day to help. It's an easy switch, but it might have some positive impact. One more thought topic that I wanted to share is about caring for employee well-being. This is a topic that I feel has really taken over the headlines. We hear so much about employee well-being these days. And we see organizations adopting so many activities, mindfulness training, well-being apps, lunchtime yoga. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal had an article about companies having on-site therapists. So during your break, you can go and see a therapist to focus on your well-being. And, I think we're starting to get pretty disenchanted with this. We know that well-being isn't going to be solved by one app. And in fact, there was a big review that was published in the Industrial Relations Journal of 46,000 workers in the UK. And it said across all of these different kinds of well-being activities, they couldn't find any relationship between specific practices and employee well-being. So it's not working. But I think as organizational researchers, we already know what the major key is to employee well-being is, and it's autonomy. There's a wealth of research out there showing that people experience less stress and greater well-being when they can control the stressors and demands in their life. So the more autonomy we build into people's jobs, the more well-being they're likely to experience. Now, what I think we forget sometimes is how complex autonomy itself can be. So there's control over how you do the work. What tools do I use? What tasks do I do first? There's also control over where you work. Am I going to work at home? Am I going to work in the office? And there's also control over when I work. So what are the hours that I'm going to work? And what's so interesting is that during COVID, we sent people home, but employees also experienced unprecedented levels of the other kinds of autonomy along with remote work. So we know that many employees started bookending their day. So they get up in the morning, they work for a few hours, and then they put work aside so that they could homeschool their kids who were also in lockdown with them. And then they return to work in the evening. What a non-standard kind of work arrangement. And yet employees felt that they were able to do that. They felt empowered to do that. And one of the things that we often talk about in the job design literature is that once you give people a taste of autonomy, they never want to go back. And what I think is so interesting about it, though, is if you look at how we're seeing this discussed in the media, it's becoming so watered down. Employees want to work at home, managers want them in the office. But again, that misses what it is we're trying to control. Sometimes it's not really where I work, but it's about how I work and when I work, and place gives me that advantage. Now you might be thinking, okay, so we're talking about line managers. What do line managers have to do with this? Well, people believe that managers are the ones who are responsible for employee well-being. A survey by Deloitte showed that 94% of employees believe that their manager should be held responsible for employees' well-being. And what's interesting is 96% of managers agree with that. So managers think that they should be responsible for employee well-being. The problem is that managers are notoriously bad at giving employees autonomy. And I'll give you two examples. I have a colleague who does this wonderful activity in her classes, and it's so simple and yet so powerful. She gives them a bunch of tasks, and she tells the students, organize them into a job, design a job. And the only difference is that this side of the room is designing a job for themselves. And that side of the room is designing a job for their employees. And it turns out that when the students design jobs for themselves, they automatically, spontaneously apply all of the best job design principles. They design the tasks so that you complete a whole and identifiable piece of work. It involves a lot of different skills. It gives the employee themselves a lot of control about how they approach the work. It's a beautiful, well-designed job. When they're designing that same set of tasks for other people to do, what they do is they give individuals one or two tasks that they already know that person is good at, and then they set it up like an assembly line. So it has no motivating power whatsoever. That's efficient, right? Shouldn't you be doing what you're good at? But we can see it in ourselves, how much we value autonomy. And the place where we're seeing this on a broad level is as more and more managers recognize that employees value working in remote locations and don't want to be in the office, they simultaneously increase their monitoring of the employees. So we're seeing an upward trend in employee surveillance. This is why we have whole businesses evolving around mouse jigglers because we have a lot of computerized tracking. So that's a great example of where we're messing up the message, right? We're sending two signals. Of course I trust you to work from home, but I don't trust you enough to not monitor it. So this is the what if I'd like you to think about. What if we really tried to pack as much autonomy into jobs as we possibly could? What would it take for us to have jobs that offered employees autonomy, not just about where they work, not just about how they work, but also about time, so that they could align these things together? What would workplaces look like if we designed those kinds of jobs? I gave you the Dropbox example here because Dropbox has been bragging about their headquarters in Dublin. And they say they specifically designed it so that when people came to the office, they were coming to the office to do very different things than they were doing at home. And so that required a very different kinds of space and also a different idea about when they were going to be using it. But I don't want to get too hung up on that example because I don't want to feel like we always have to tear down headquarters and build a new building in order to make this happen. We should be able to build it into the design process. But then because we're talking about line managers, how do we give managers the empowerment to give employees that autonomy? How do we educate managers about how important autonomy is? Sit with that one for a minute. So what's the start here? What if you're a line manager who is in an environment, who is in a workplace that doesn't give employees a lot of autonomy? And the start here is put your own oxygen mask on first. It surprises me very much how little autonomy we give managers. During COVID, managers were the last people to leave offices and work from home. Now that people are returning to office environments, managers are the first ones to come back. Managers, when you become a manager, one of the first things you do is give up control over your schedule. So other people can just kind of put meetings in there and schedule your time. So it's very hard for managers to exert control over their own autonomy. It's interesting in that Deloitte survey that I mentioned where employees and managers agree that managers should be responsible for employee well-being. What they also found in that survey is that only 30% of employees say that they know how managers take care of themselves. So managers aren't doing a very good job of role modeling self-care. Now, I was pretty cheeky in my photo, wasn't I? And the reason I put an airplane there is because one of the things we had always heard from managers is, where do they do their best work? On long-haul flights. Because that was the one place when they were not subject to the day-to-day interruptions. where they had the opportunity to be reflective and do deep work and strategic work and really go in as opposed to dealing with other people's environments. But of course, if we're trying to transform organizations to be more sustainable, one of the first things we cut out is long-haul travel. So it's part of the big challenge. So I just want to make two more points before I give you all a chance to discuss. The first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to think about line managers. And the second thing I want to say is I gave you some examples of really small, easy things that line managers could do. And I think the most important thing is that we just start anywhere. That we just start putting line managers more front and center in any kind of transformation that we're trying to initiate in organizations.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Carol, and thank you for building in time for us to reflect on the questions. Do we have any questions for Carol in the room or online? If you could prompt them online, Barbara, that'd be great.
Let's ask a question. Thank you for the presentation, Carol. That was really, really thought-provoking. So as you're speaking, I'm thinking a lot between this tension between the individual and the collective, and about how training and culture and economic ideology all leans towards the individual, but yet what we're really talking about here in terms of a healthy line management system is a sense of the collective. How do you think we calibrate that when it seems like we're going more and more towards the individual, especially the statistic about people saying that they'll never be a manager? That was actually quite surprising. Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. That is one of the primary tensions, is between how much do we design systems that meet individual needs while maintaining some of these social relationships. And the only real answer I have to that is think about attaching the social piece every step of the way. So I was recently reading about Philips Healthcare, and they do lots of online training. But one of the things that they've built into their system is they encourage employees to develop training playlists. And so the idea is you go into the system, one of the first things you would find are the other employees who had already taken that training. And they would make recommendations for which of the training programs were really good, which ones should you take after this. And I thought, oh, that's really clever that each time you're trying to create a social connection, even though people are in fact acting alone. And I think if you develop that sort of pattern in every decision and every change, I think that's a good starting point.
Let me provoke on Chris's comment just a moment. I think the number you have, 62% of employees did want to be a manager.
New employees.
New employees.
Yeah, so these are labor market entrants.
Yeah.
So these are people at the very start of their career.
On the other side, I could argue that's a good thing, because if everyone wanted to be a boss, we'd have trouble, right? Because we also need bosses in an organization. So we need some different
contributors. And I actually really agree with that point. I would just say that I think if you're going to accept that, if you're going to say, okay, well, maybe we need fewer managers, maybe we shouldn't do that, you really have to be prepared to change your reward system. Because historically, the way people benefited was to get promoted. And we know that in the careers literature, when organizations have tried to develop secondary tracks, they're never long enough. There's only a couple of rungs, or people still knew that it wasn't going to get you the rewards that you got on the traditional track. So you have to really be prepared to make a lot of changes to support it.
Just wondering if there's any questions online. None so far, so keen to hear from questions for those who are online. If I just take a different tack, Carol, there's this common theme you've got around, line managers are the busiest, we put a lot of onus on them. And I'm conscious in our Industry Transformation Training Centre, our partner investigators are also, they're not line managers, they're typically, they're further up in seniority, and they also have that same challenge, in their, the people bringing in, the contracts, the clients, and so, we're sort of at a precarious point, as we go into start our placements. I think your presentations really highlighted to me, and hopefully us, that who we're working with in these placements is going to be important to give space to engage in the innovation. So I was just wondering, from your own collaborations with industry, whether you have any tips about how to make that process work, when you're working with very busy people very high up in the organization.
One of the things that I think is really important is that people, the higher you go in the organization, I think the more responsive managers are to data. I really do believe that. I feel like when I talk to line managers, they really trust their guts a lot, and they say, I'm confident about what I'm doing, I'm going to stick to the tried and true. But I think that the more experience you have as a manager, the more you've seen exceptions, the more you recognize that you don't always get it right. And so I think being really clear about the consequences of some of the behavior that we see across organizations, I think that's something that audience tends to be really receptive to. The other thing that I think that senior managers understand as an argument is that they can't do it all themselves. We know that the best senior managers recognize the things that they don't know, and that those are the people they have to bring onto the team who will fill in those gaps in the knowledge. And so I think this idea about how important social relations are is an argument that really resonates with senior people. They know they can't do it alone, and so they need to figure out ways to develop social nets so that employees reinforce messages for one another, or are prepared to step in and help one another, to socialize one another, to pick up workloads from one another. I think we just don't realize how much we've lost along the way, that those social relationships have to be really actively managed today.
Can I ask another question? So another part of your presentation was about putting yourself in the position of the employee and designing the job around the employer, which I thought was a really, really interesting duality. I guess I'm then trying to have some empathy for the managers. And I know if I was to design a job as a manager, I'm thinking accountability, hitting targets, risk, all of these things that's in their world. I'm just wondering when autonomy, which is this really important thing, how again there's a tension between giving someone autonomy but being really sure that the thing's gonna happen, which is why I think everything gets broken down into a assembly line.
And I think that the answer to that one in a job design perspective is you don't have to go from 0 to 100, right? You can say, I'm going to take some risks here, and we're going to treat it as a pilot. We're just going to treat it as an experiment. Let's try this for a month and see how it works. I'm a really big fan of anything that uses the language of pilot or experiment, because it means we're going to have to reassess it, and we might change our minds, or we might be able to build on it and do it more. And I think that some of the language that I use about what if and start here really gives you the extremes, because I think that you only can imagine the future by thinking about these really extreme things, but you don't have to get there all at once.
Yeah.
Let me add a bit to that. I'm doing some work on simple rules in the strategy area. And simple rules basically means you have some level of formalization and some level of flexibility, some level of autonomy, right? the idea of bounded improvisation. So you can be improvisational, but within bounds. So the manager's role then is to define the bounds, but then allow the flexibility within those rules.
Yeah.
So there's a way of thinking and talking about and designing structures, if you will, organizational rules, that map into this notion of giving some degree of flexibility and also some feel of control.
Yeah.
And I love that, but the only thing I want to add to that is it's not something that a manager will do spontaneously. Because you put me in the job because I was so good at the thing that my employee now is supposed to. I know the best way to do it. I've been doing it for 10 years, trust me. And so it really does require active managing of the manager to develop that mindset.
Line managers, yeah.
Interesting. We have a question online from Gavin next. So Gavin, over to you.
So I guess I was curious, particularly in the lens of the AEC industry, architecture firms, for example, since we've went to a more hybrid/remote model, it seems like there's just more meetings than ever to ensure reporting lines remain open, right? We actually have probably more meetings than we had in person because they're almost too easy to make on Teams. But I was curious if, I guess in your research, you've seen other mechanisms, platforms or systems or frameworks that have, I guess, kept people more available for core business service that don't require, many meetings to enable.
I think that what you're describing is a very common phenomenon. You would have seen the people in the room all nodding, particularly those of us who work in academic environments. We're having the same experience. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that as more meetings go online, we've also taken away from people the little bits of slack that they used to have in between the meetings to process what had just happened in the meeting. I remember reading some management history that talked about how the world changed, how the world of work changed when we started getting personal printers in our offices. Because there used to be these moments where you had to get up from your desk and go to the central printer, and sometimes you had to stand there and wait in the queue a little bit, and you would create these relationships and you'd have applause and you'd rethink what you were doing, and then you'd go back and pick it up again. And so now, of course, we don't want people to have personal printers, because we're trying to reduce the amount of printing in general. So maybe we're going to reintroduce the sort of social connections. But I think that you're right. I think that the whole meetings have just sort of exploded. I think that one strategy is to really think about what happens in meetings and what are meetings for. So if it's just sort of a touch-base meeting, maybe that's a memo. If it's really a brainstorming kind of task, well, maybe that's a meeting that needs more slack around it. So I just think it needs more informed kind of planning. There's one more piece that I wanted to mention, and it's because you specifically mentioned architecture as a profession. I'm really concerned about what's happening with professions in today's workplaces. When I talk to lawyers, they say that the amount of professional development that happens in the first year out of law school is just tremendous. And it happens because junior lawyers see senior lawyers actively working. So if you're a junior lawyer, you might get assigned to write a draft of a brief, and you would actually see your boss take a red pencil to it and create the changes. And now that those people aren't co-located in terms of working, the junior lawyers don't see that work being done. The work just kind of gets moved down the line. And so that's the kind of thing that I think would be great to move into a meeting space. Let me show you what I'm going to do with your piece of work, because this is part of your professional development. But I also know that your question was, tell me about a platform, tell me about a program, tell me about a product. I don't know. I can tell you the process, but I don't know the product.
So I guess not necessarily a piece of software per se, I don't know if there's any like frameworks of management you found work well in a hybrid scenario. So, Lean, Agile, Scrum, those sorts of methods, or that they're more used to people being in person with groups, in my experience, that maybe haven't caught up to the reality. That's good. Well, it's good to know we're all sharing the same challenges.
No, I think a lot of these things we're only even starting to think about them as we're seeing the problems. So I think we're still a ways away from developing a strategic solution.
Good research question.
Good placement.
Yeah.
I'm going to just add, I love your point about adding time in between. Meetings definitely are end to end these days, so I mean that's a great tip, and one that I think I can talk to people about. And I like the idea of the water cooler discussion. We need those in between sort of moments to have natural interactions. So yeah, great point. Thank you.
One of the things we've been playing with is, it's so easy in a Zoom's meeting, you choose half an hour, you choose an hour. What if you always chose 45 minutes? Wouldn't that be great to always have 45 minutes in between, the 15 minutes in between?
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I just want to share, in fact, I don't have a question. I just want to share my experience. In fact, it's very interesting how we see the work environment change from one culture to another or from one country to another. So I'd like to share my own experience. I'm an architect and I've been working in the AC industry in Sweden. And what is interesting about Sweden is how the working day look like, whether you work in an organization, public or private or university, it doesn't matter. There is some kind of a pattern of the working day. How does it look like? So we come at 8 o'clock, like everybody. At 9 o'clock, we have breakfast for half an hour. And you don't have to have breakfast. You could just sit there and have a cup of coffee if you want to. You don't have to have breakfast, but we have to have this half an hour together in the morning. Then we work from 9:30 to 12. At 12, we have lunch. Everybody have lunch at 12 o'clock till 1 o'clock. And then at 3 o'clock, we have something, we call it fika. Fika in Swedish, it means like coffee time. But in fact, it's not coffee time. Exactly. For us, it's kind of a break. And it's very important for us that this kind of window of 1 hour and a half or 2 hours between those breaks, we do deep work. We don't interact with each other so much, to be honest. But then this kind of a break, we also try to talk about things that are not related to work. And in a way, because right now I'm reading a book called Deep Work for Cal Newport. Maybe some of you know that kind of work. And he was mentioning, in fact, that kind of thing, that your subconscious brain need that kind of a break so you can solve these kind of problems that you got stuck in the 1 hour and a half or 2 hours. So I was just thinking I had this pattern, but I didn't know that there is a scientific explanation behind it. And I just wanted to share that. I thought it was interesting that there was certain time with certain hour that we gather together. There's also for social is very important. But at the same time, I have my own window, my own deep work that I'm trying to do the task in a very productive way. So thank you very much. It's just a sharing comment from my side.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I thought it was a really, really great concrete illustration, a great example. And I would just add to your language about deep work. The other book that I thought was really interesting was The Power of Quiet by Susan Cain, where she talks about the power that introverts could have in the workplace. And these sorts of gaps are really important for introverts to recharge and do that pre-meeting reflection that's going to make them more effective in the meeting. So I think those gaps serve multiple purposes.
Hello, Carol. Thank you so much. It was a really nice presentation. My question is more about what recommendation you can do. For example, we as researchers, we are doing the PhD. Actually, we are our own manager. So how to remove this kind of bias to be too pleasant or to be too critic in your own work, because obviously you are working most of the time solo. And do you have any advice for this kind of situation that you are your own manager in a certain way?
can I just check the question? So there's a lot of PhD students in the room, whether that be from ITTC or other schools, and you spend a lot of time being your own manager. And so how do you apply these principles? Is that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Let me reflect on that. I'll just kind of try and work backwards a little bit. I often try to think about what our literature applies to our own jobs. So just thinking about well-being, I do think we're trying to encourage students in general to be more mindful of well-being and to be conscious of long hours and to take breaks. So that would be one strategy for self-management, to understand that you have to self-manage your self-care as well as you're managing your self-work. But I think one of the strongest examples for me is that first one about training and development. You know, training and development isn't a literature that I knew when I was a student. And now I think if I did know that literature, I could have maximized my own learning a lot better. You know, it would show me where I was making some mistakes. So maybe if I was going to give you one piece of advice, it would read outside of your own literature. I've learned so much by reading training literature, which is actually can be a little bit dry, but has such huge implications. I've learned a lot by reading communication literature, so just kind of getting out of the management business literature is really powerful.
Thanks, Carol. That's I think that will also come naturally, given that we're an interdisciplinary centre, and there are actually more opportunities built into the program with Friday afternoon seminar sessions and our work placements. And so it's interesting because I think the PhDs in our ITT centre have minimal modes of learning because there's more opportunities to have role models, you know, from our partner investigators, from other people that they bring onto those projects, you know, line managers, people who are driving the technology transformation. And so I suppose encourage everyone in the room to pick up every opportunity they've got for learning. So look, I think we will wrap up questions there. If there's any burning remaining questions, please do stay online. And we've got further discussion in the room here amongst the PhDs. So thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you have got some takeaways, and I think what's really powerful, Carol, about your work is that you're simultaneously taking that big picture and looking for immediate takeaways, small actions that we can start to implement and nudge our way forward as we look to transform our organisations and industry. So thank you for joining us. Let's thank Carol.
And thanks to all of you. I thought the questions were so thoughtful and provocative in themselves.